Welcome back everyone to our next video in our Advanced Squad Leader training. This is your host, ID Jester, and today we're going to talk about defensive fire and what that means. Before we talk about defensive fire, we have to review our different phases of the game. If you look at our phase disc, it's located on our map. If you recall, the first phase you enter into in a given turn is your rally phase. Once you completed your rally phase, you're going to go into your prep fire phase, PF/PH. When you enter into your prep fire phase, you've essentially entered into what I call the meat of the action round, which are the next four phases: the prep fire phase, the movement phase, the defensive fire phase, and the advanced fire phase. These four phases are linked very tightly together in what I call the ballet of death. The reason I call it the ballet of death is I feel that whichever side is able to maneuver and tiptoe through these very delicate phases and able to use their units to the best of their abilities will most likely win the scenario. If you recall, in the prep fire phase, the attacker is able to shoot enemy units within line of sight. During the movement phase, those units that did not prep fire are going to be able to move. During the movement phase, your opponent can interrupt you with defensive first fire. Once that phase is complete, we actually go into the defensive fire phase, where your opponent is able to fire units. And then finally, in the advanced fire phase, those units that you had moved can finally shoot. So there's a constant struggle and balance, not only between the attacker, but also defender, on what he should do with his units during these four important phases. When we talk about defensive fire, we're talking about the middle two of these four very important phases: the movement phase and the defensive fire phase. Let's look at the rules that cover defensive fire first. Rule 8.1 talks about first fire, in which defensive fire is unique in that it can occur during the enemy movement phase as well as during your own defensive fire phase. This portion occurs during the enemy movement phase, is called the defensive first fire, and can be used versus a moving unit. So again, when your opponent enters into his movement phase, you are able to use your defensive units to attack those units that he is moving during his movement phase. But you will notice that right after this phase comes the defensive fire phase, in which all your units that haven't fired can fire. So why would you spend any of your units attacking during your opponent's movement phase and not just wait until the defensive fire phase? Well, there's some bonuses that you might be able to get in your opponent's movement phase that you wouldn't receive in the defensive fire phase. If you recall from a previous tutorial video, we talked about first fire, move in the open, and first fire, non-assault move. These are defensive fire bonuses that you can receive if your opponent is not assault moving or he is moving his units out into the open. If you receive any of these bonuses, either one or both, you're going to get a -1 to your attack for each of those that apply. Another very important thing that you receive during your opponent's movement phase and you execute a defensive fire attack is what they call residual firepower attack. If we look at our rules under residual firepower, which is 8.2, when a unit is attacked by defensive first fire, subsequent first fire, or final protective fire, the target location in which the attack is resolved, even in bypass, is marked with a residual firepower counter equal to half of the highest IFT column used for that attack. So what does that mean? What that basically means is if you were to attack, if this American unit decides to move into this space, you do an attack from your 838 unit into that space. That attack is going to be an 8 firepower attack, because his firepower is 8. If we look at our IFT chart, it's going to be a 8 firepower attack, but you're going to leave half of your firepower residual in that hex. So half of 8 is 4. In this case, there is a 4 column, so you would leave a 4 residual firepower attack in that hex. If, for example, you used a 6 firepower attack, half of 6 is 3, you notice there isn't a 3 column, so it's going to slide down to the 2 column. So you're going to leave 2 firepower residual attack. If you attacked with a 4 firepower attack, half of 4 is 2, so you're going to leave a 2 firepower residual attack, etc., etc. I have some counters here on our map that have some of the things we're going to be talking about. But in this situation here, we used our 838 to attack into hex F6. Half of his firepower is a 4, so he's going to leave a residual attack in that hex of 4 firepower, which means that any other American unit that moves into that hex during their movement phase will first be attacked by this 4 firepower attack before anything else is resolved. So with your defensive fire during your opponent's movement phase, you would get a residual firepower attack that can steer enemy units from entering certain hexes. Obviously, if we had attacked this unit, the 666, in F6, all these other units here that wanted to move up are not going to enter into that space unless they're going to take a 4 firepower residual attack. So you can kind of prevent where your enemies are most likely to enter. You can funnel them, you can keep them from entering certain hexes without taking an attack. So that's one of the big bonuses you would get, is a residual firepower, because if you remember, here in our text, each game turn represents about 2 minutes of actual game time. So although this unit shot into that hex, it's assuming through the game abstractly that throughout the whole game turn, he's shooting into that hex and firing at any enemy units that enter into that hex, and not just into the one unit at this one specific time. When our unit, the 838 German unit, made his attack into F6, he is going to get a first fire counter on top of his squad counter, showing that he has first fired. There's actually several more different steps to defensive fire. The next step would be what they call subsequent first fire. And what that means is a defending unit, infantry unit, already marked with a first fire counter, may defensive first fire again during the movement phase as area fire by flipping his first fire counter over to the final fire side. Such fire can leave residual firepower, but if using a machine gun or an infantry firepower equivalent, it is treated as sustained fire and penalized accordingly. If we look at our rules for sustained fire, which are right here, 9.3, a machine gun that attacks using subsequent first fire or final protective fire or during the defensive fire phase while marked with a first fire counter is using sustained fire, and consequently his break number is lowered by 2, in addition to its firepower being halved as area fire. So, if our 838 German squad had fired on our American 666 during the movement phase, let me advance this into our movement phase here. It is the American, you can tell by our phase counter here on our map, because it has the Allies on one side. So it's the Americans, and whatever side is towards the top is what phase it is. So we're in the Americans movement phase here. Americans can move any and all of his units that have not prep fired, if you recall. So these units here that have already prep fired are unable to move during this phase. So our German 838 has first fired into F6. Let's assume he didn't do anything on the attack. He missed his attack, but he does leave a 4 firepower residual attack in that hex. At this point, the 666 decides that he's done moving. He doesn't want to get any closer. But we have another unit here, this 346 in G8. He decides to also move. It moves into this space here, and then it moves into this space here. We can use subsequent first fire for our 838 German elite unit in F5, but let's look at the basic rules that cover subsequent first fire. Subsequent first fire is area fire and can only be used by small arms, machine guns, and infantry firepower equivalents. The target must be within the fire's normal range and not greater than the range to the closest enemy unit. So what closest enemy known unit? I'm sorry. Let's try to expand that out. So these are two very important things to keep in mind. Is subsequent first fire can only happen in the normal range of your unit, and it cannot have any known enemy unit that is closer. So in this case here, this squad has half squad actually, because it has 2 silhouettes on it. This half squad is moved into G6. Our 838 unit, full squad, decides to subsequent first fire into that hex. And subsequent first fire, if you recall, is area fire. Area fire is going to half your attack. So you're going to get half firepower for basically your second defensive fire attack. You also, the other rules accompanying subsequent first fire, machine guns must be used or forfeited for the remainder of that player turn. Basically, if a squad and a machine gun are going to subsequent first fire, they have to be used unless you forfeit it for the remainder of the player turn. There are some exceptions to that. You do get to use it again if we're doing final protective fire, but I haven't mentioned that yet, so I didn't want to confuse you. Machine guns and infantry firepower equivalent are subject to sustained fire penalties, which are half firepower. Your break number is lowered by 2. You get no rate of fire on your machine guns. And you cannot fire a single man counter that's firing a machine gun. So there are some extra rules with subsequent first fire to make sure you can actually do it. A few other notes with subsequent first fire. Subsequent first fire is NA if a fire lane was laid with first fire. And a unit gets one subsequent first fire attack, then it and its support weapons are marked with final fire, regardless of what got used in its first fire. So again, once you do your sustained first fire, you must use your machine guns or you're going to forfeit them for the rest of the turn. Your squads and your machine guns are going to get marked with final fire regardless of who had already used first fire. So in this case, our 838 German Elite uses subsequent first fire, shoots into G6, and now its first fire counter is removed for a final fire counter. So it is now under a final fire counter, which means it had shot its first defensive fire and it has shot its subsequent first fire. After his attack, let's assume again that it had no effect on our 346 American Brave unit, and this unit decides to move adjacent to our 838 German Elite. Well, our German Elite's under a final fire. Can he do anything about this American moving adjacent to him? He's already defensive first fired, he's already subsequent first fired, and he's under a final fire counter. Actually, there is something he can do about that. And lastly, we'll talk about our final protective fire, or FPF. FPF, final protective fire, is a subsequent fire option available only to the defending infantry already marked with the final fire counter when an enemy unit moves into an adjacent or in the same hex as the attacker during the attacking movement phase. So what that means, Rule 8.31, is even though I'm under a final fire marker, I've defensive fired, first fired, and I've subsequent first fired, I'm under my final fire counter, I can still final protective fire, kind of protect myself if anybody moves adjacent to me. But there are consequences, aren't there always, if you do this? Final protective fire is also considered area fire, but you will get your point blank firepower for having the unit be adjacent to you, or triple point blank fire if it's actually in the same hex as you. Of course, your machine guns or your infantry firepower equivalent are going to be marked with sustained fire again, and you lose your rate of fire. The only allowed range on this is 0 or 1. Your infantry firepower die roll also acts as a normal morale check versus the firing unit. This is basically the biggest part about final defensive fire, is that whatever you roll on the chart whatever your dice roll is, without any of the modifiers, are actually going to be a morale check against your unit to see if these guys that are moving adjacent to you, your guys are struggling to fight them off with final protective fire. And we need to find out whether or not your units stay strong and resist, or if they cower and break. So, for example, let's say our 346 had moved adjacent. We're shooting our 8 firepower, half because it is area fire. We do get it doubled because the unit is adjacent, so we're up to 8 firepower. And we're going to roll 2d6. We would also get a -1 for the non-assault move. And we would also get a -1 for this unit moving in the open. So this would be an 8 attack with a -2 to the dice roll. The -2 only applies to your attack. It does not apply to your morale check. So in this case, we're going to roll 2d6. We rolled an 11. An 11 on the 8 column, 11 minus 2 is a 9 on the 8 column. Gives that unit a pin task check. But an 11 also is higher than our morale of 8. So this unit is just too frightened by the Americans moving adjacent to them, and they basically are going to break. So that shows you the consequences of final protective fire. It can help protect a unit if units move up adjacent to it, even though they have defensive first fired and subsequent first fired. They can also use their final protective fire to try to protect themselves. But the consequence is, can I resist my morale check with my die roll? And if I don't, then my unit breaks, which will be bad. So last but not least, when the movement phase is complete for the attacker, we're going to move into our defensive fire phase, and we'll look at our rules for our defensive fire phase. That portion of defensive fire which occurs during the defensive fire phase is called final fire. During final fire, any of the defender's units or weapons that are not marked with a first, final, intensive, or no fire counter may fire. Any such unit's weapons which are marked with a first fire counter can only fire again as area fire against adjacent or same hex enemy units. A unit or weapon already marked with a final fire counter cannot fire during final fire phase or defensive fire phase. Final fire acts as all applicable units in the target location, not just those who have moved, but without any of our modifiers, which we talked about, FFNAM and FFMO. So you can see that as soon as your opponent's movement phase is over, all of your units that do not have a final fire, I'm sorry, couldn't find what I was looking for there. All your units that are not marked, let me cancel this. Alright, there we go. All your units that are not marked with a first, final, intensive, or no fire counter may fire. And those that are marked with a first fire counter can only fire adjacently. So basically, what the rules don't say is if your units fired during your opponent's movement phase and they have a first fire counter, I'm just going to bring these out here so you can see them a little better. They're very similar, first fire and final fire, but if you have a first fire counter on your unit, that means that you had fired once and you're only going to get to fire again in the defensive fire phase if there's an enemy that's adjacent to you. If you have no, let's take for example down here in F3, if we have no counter on us whatsoever, we get to fire normally. So our 4, 6, 7 in our defensive fire phase can shoot at this unit full firepower. But notice this unit is no longer moving because the movement phase is over. We're in the defensive fire phase. So he's not going to get the -1 for the FFMO for moving the open, and FFNAM, which is the non-assault move. So in this situation, if this squad had moved up here, and we had the opportunity to defensive fire with this guy, we would have had a -2 to our attack. But if we chose not to do it, and we waited till the defensive fire phase, we don't get those bonuses anymore. So it's just going to be a straight attack on the 4 column with no -1 for moving the open and no -1 for the non-assault move. So that's why I call this the ballet of death, because you have to be able to understand what you can do with your different units and use them to the best of your abilities. A good example of this is, let me remove some of these counters off the map here, and we'll go through a couple of quick examples of what can help and what situations and how to think about different aspects of these phases of death. It is, as you can tell, the Americans had just finished their prep fire phase. We have a couple American units over here in B6 and C7. They had fired into D4, did an attack, but no outcome whatsoever. So now it is moved into the movement phase. Let me go ahead and remove this as well and put these units back into their proper slots here. Okay, during the movement phase, the Americans can move any or all of their units that they wish to move during the movement phase. As the defender, you have to realize that if I use my units to attack now, I won't be able to attack in the defensive fire phase unless they're adjacent to me, is the basic overview. There are a few restrictions and rules for that, but basically if I fire during my opponent's movement phase, I'm not going to be able to shoot again during the defensive fire phase with my unit unless I have an enemy that's adjacent to me. So for example, if I was to take this unit here in I7, the 546 American unit, it decides to move, assault move during the movement phase, and it moves into this hex right here. Obviously we could defensive fire with this stack of units right here, right now, and we can do an attack against them. The problem is we're not going to get a bonus for defensively for this unit moving in the open because it's still in the woods, and we're not going to get a bonus for the non-assault move because it did assault move. Assault moved into that hex. We know that this unit, when we do an assault move, you can only move into one adjacent hex or one adjacent location. We know that this unit can't move anymore. So as a defender, it's not advantageous for us to waste our attack defensively with our units in K5, because I don't get a bonus to this attack. If I was to go ahead and first fire into this hex here, sure, I might be able to hurt this unit, I might be able to damage it, break it, even kill it, but strategically or tactically, that is not a good move by this unit here, because it no longer has a first fire attack, and it didn't get any bonus other than putting a residual into that hex. Probably most likely these other units aren't going to move into that hex either, so tactically and strategically, shooting with this very powerful stack of units, add a unit that you're not getting any bonuses on, tactically is not a good move. Now, if there was a reason to do this for the simple purposes of maybe the American needs to have so many squads on level 2 hexes, and it's late in the game, and if he gets his squad up on level 2, then he's going to win the game. Sure, yeah, obviously you want to take your attack, shoot at it, try to break it before it can move up there. But as a basic overview, when you're the defender during your opponent's movement phase, you want to use your units that will allow you to defensive fire, where you can put residual firepower in hexes that you think your opponent might move into, or when you get your bonus of FFMO or FFNAM. So for example, if we look at hex F7, when this 666 moves, say, into this hex here, it actually might be worth doing an attack from our 838 into this hex because of several reasons. The reasons being, he did an assault move, and he moved in the open, so I'm going to get a -2 to my attack. The other thing is I'm going to put a firepower residual into that hex, so any of these other squads that want to move down, headed towards this building hex, they're going to have to go through that residual firepower hex and take an attack along the way, or they're going to have to go around it, which all of a sudden allows you to get more attacks on there. So strategically and tactically, if this 666 moves into this hex, the 838 doing a defensive first fire attack is a wise and tactically good decision. The other thing to keep in mind when you're talking about defensive fire in your opponent's movement phase is, and you'll see a lot of this happen during the rally phase at the beginning of the turn, is some nationalities are able to deploy, which takes your full squads and breaks them down into 2 half squads. And the reason for that is, let's take a look at M7. You can see that M7 is a half squad here. Let's say our M7 moves into this space here during the movement phase. Well, it puts a bind into the Germans here. The Germans have to decide tactically what is the best decision for them to do. It's a good shot because you have a plenty good firepower. It's non-assault moving, so you get a -1 to your attack. He is moving out in the open, so another -1 to your attack. So you could probably, with your 9 firepower, it's going to go down to the 8 column. 8, -1 for your leader, -1 for non-assault move, -1 for move in the open, so it's an 8 -3 attack. You can see on our chart here, if we rolled, say, a 7 minus 3, we would get a 2MC, making that unit make a morale check with a 2 penalty, 2 added to his dice roll, so he probably will fail his morale check. If he does that, though, we were going to get a first fire counter put on our units. The reason that's important is if I was to take these units here in N6 and I move them into N5, well, our units in K5 decide, oh man, I can see you now, you're really good targets, there's a leader in there, a 9-1 leader, I'd like to kill that 9-1 leader, and you moved out in the open and you're non-assault moving, and yeah, I'm going to go ahead and shoot you. Oh, wait a minute, remember, I have a first fire counter on me, which means the only thing I can do is subsequent first fire. With subsequent first fire, I can only attack units that are the closest to me. If you see that this hex in L6 is 2 spaces away, our unit in N5 is 3 spaces away, so this unit can dance on the hill and pull their pants down and moon the Germans, and there's nothing the Germans can do because they chose to first fire on this half squad. So as you can see, it's a real ballet as to what you can do not only as the attacker during your prep fire phase. Do you spend some time trying to break some of these enemy units that you know will be able to attack your moving targets? So for example, if our 2 units here that had prep fired had shot at this guy and had broken him, when our 666 moves here, then all of a sudden he's got a better opportunity to get into this hex because you have prep fired and broken this unit. Obviously, we would have to use a different unit here. This one here has got a firepower of 4, and it's got a range of 3, so it would get a 4 attack. But still, you've knocked out his 838 unit, an elite unit, and you tactically have a better chance now to move these units maybe up into this building without them getting attacked along the way. So it's a ballet of, do I prep fire to try to wound some of the enemy units and try to break them, because I know when I move my units, they're going to get shot at by the defender. And then at the same time, the defender has to think, these guys are moving, and I can shoot at them. And is it a good shot? Because even if I don't shoot now, I'm going to get a chance later. Unless, of course, he moves into terrain where you can't see him any longer. So you have to think about, I know I'm going to get a chance to shoot all my defensive units during the next phase, during my defensive fire phase. So I want to only use the units that are going to give me a bonus to my attack or strategically or tactically help me manipulate the attacker during his movement phase. If I can put a firepower attack in this hex, and this hex, and this hex, and maybe even this hex, by defensive fire, then all of a sudden, if this unit was to move into there, and then he moved into here, and he moved into here, and he moved into here, and I was able to defensive fire with different units, then all of a sudden I've got residual firepower all over the place. And now, strategically and tactically, he's got to decide, do I move this guy into this hex and take my residual firepower attack? Or is he got to spend time going all the way around so he's not attacked? So, as I mentioned a few episodes ago in a different tutorial video, not only are your units vital to you during your attack phases, but they are strategically and tactically just as important to you during your phases when you're the defender, because you can manipulate what the attacker can do, where he can go, what the outcome of his movement phase is based on your defensive fire tactics. So again, the prep fire phase, the movement phase, the defensive fire phase, and the advanced fire phase is a ballet of death where you have to decide what is going to be the best move for your different units. How can I best use my unit? Is it going to be best to use it during the prep fire phase where I can attack my enemy and possibly break them so that they can't shoot at me? Is it going to be better for me to move my units and risk getting shot at, risk getting broken as they move to try and get into better positions? During that phase, the defender has to think, is it better for me to shoot at the enemy units that are moving now, or would it be better for me to wait to the defensive fire phase? Is this the unit I want to shoot at? Because he's got all of his other units that have not prep fired ready to move. So if he moves up a half squad, is it worth first firing at a half squad when I know there's many other more important targets to shoot at? And then finally, defensive fire phase. Defensive firing, was I able to leave some units out there that are able to defensive fire so I can still have targets to shoot at? If I waited to attack during my opponent's movement phase and he ended up moving all of his units behind cover so I can no longer see them or out of range, then all of a sudden my defensive fire phase is wasted. And then back to the attacker again, my advanced fire phase. I've finally moved my units. I've gotten them into better positions. Now, I've risked life and limb to get them into these positions, but they can only fire at half firepower. Did I waste all their firepower trying to get them into new positions? Did I risk getting my units broken to try and get into better tactical or strategic locations, but I get to only fire at half firepower? So again, these four phases are intertwined in the resolution of the attacker and the defender, and whichever side is able to manipulate their units to the best of their ability will most likely have an advantage throughout the scenario. So keep this in mind when you're playing your ASL games. Defensive fire, very important. And even when you're the defender, concentrate. Watch what your opponent's doing. Watch what locations he's after. Remember what your scenario objectives are. And hopefully I was able to shed some light on the different parts of defensive fire. Thanks for joining me. This is ID Jester, signing off.